This is a brief lecture on research and writing. When you do research and writing, you need to consider your purpose and the range of sources you're going to need to find. You want to think about primary and secondary sources and what those are and how to use them. You're also going to look at citing your sources accurately and using a method for citing them. That's my cat in the background, sorry. In this class, it's going to be the Chicago method. We will have a short bibliography for your project in slide 6, which I will show you. And then you'll also think a little bit about why the Chicago method is a good method. So if you're going to do research, whether you're going to buy a Shelby, or you're going to buy a tiny house log cabin, or you're going to look for a cheap personal loan in India, all of those things are research projects, but they aren't projects that necessarily lead to a paper. They do have financial implications, but they aren't something you have to write up as an academic paper. But if you're going to write an academic paper, you need to think about doing solid research in an academic fashion, and you need to think about learning what types of academic writing you can do. So I am adapting and borrowing from my English 101 class, and we're going to be covering research and types of academic writing in one brief lecture. So first of all, you need to consider your purpose. Are you changing understanding, or are you changing people's actions, or are you doing some of both? So for instance, are you arranging facts and summarizing? That's a skill that everybody needs in academic writing. It's kind of a what. You're building an understanding for the reader, building things up together. Perhaps you are explaining facts and you're analyzing texts. You're doing what and why. In other words, you're changing the reader's understanding. And that typically is the kind of paper you write for history, or the sciences, or psychology, or literature. It's possible that you may be explaining the facts and analyzing texts and making an argument for action, doing a what, why, and how we should change what we're doing, changing the reader's understanding and recommending social or political change. And sometimes you get papers like that in English, but more commonly that's speech communication, politics, education, or sociology. For right now, we're doing explaining facts and analyzing, so we're going to be doing the what and the why. That's typical for a history class. You're changing the reader's understanding about something. So if you're changing understanding, the what and the why, then you need to think about the range of sources, and the range of sources depends on several factors. First of all, what is the size of the existing pool of writing and thinking? If you're going to do a Lord Howe Island stick insect paper, there may not be a whole lot written about that because these particular stick insects live on one island in the entire world, in one bush on one island in the entire world. So there's not a plethora of sources on this topic. However, if you choose to write on Shakespeare, you will be reading and reading and reading and reading. So you need to think about the size of the existing pool of writing and thinking on your topic. Then you also need to think about the level of expertise you need to have in order to answer whatever question it is for your audience. So if you went to your boss and you said, hey, how many sources do I need to write? If your boss said, write me, do some research on how we're going to get to the moon, and you said, how many sources do I need? 5? Your boss would say, what, are you crazy? Look at it until you know what you need to know. So you need to think about whether or not your question is a difficult one and you need to have a lot of sources because your audience is an expert, or your question is not so complicated and you don't need as many sources. But in this case, this kind of random answer 5 is only suitable for things that your audience is not an expert in and you are not expected to be an expert in. For many, I'll say, more realistic subjects, you really do need to do quite a lot of reading. All right, if you're assembling sources, and perhaps it's not 5 and perhaps it's not 100, but if you're assembling sources, you need to have primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are things like the evening news or a newspaper. There's something that happened on the spot right away. The people who were there were interviewed or were put in the paper. It has the authority of immediacy. It happened right now and the people who were there saw it happen. Another way of thinking about sources is to think about secondary sources. Those are sources that have been written after the fact. The author has collected many primary sources and thought about them and has compiled them into a secondary source, an accounting of what happened and why. It usually has the authority of perspective. There's been time spent thinking and understanding what happened. You also need to think about the quality of interest in a source. For instance, somebody may have a particular interest in protecting the reputation of someone, and so the source is written from a particular perspective. There may be money involved, and so it may be that somebody wants to protect the ability to make money or to not lose money. You also need to think about who, as a peer, is evaluating those sources. Is there someone out there, an independent source, who is not connected by money or reputation, and who evaluates that book or that article as being excellent and unbiased? These are questions you need to think about. Last but not least, you want to try to stir it up. Look for a mix of sources, primary, secondary, and consider whether or not any of those sources have particular interests in them. All right, we've talked about the research and writing tasks by considering your purpose, by considering the range of sources you need, and by advising you to assemble primary and secondary sources. Now, how do you represent those sources in your paper? Well, the first thing, of course, is you cite them. You don't steal. You make sure everybody knows where you found your sources. And if you have some questions about what you have to cite, I'm happy to take questions in the office hours. I'm also happy to take questions by email. This is something that if you want to be careful and not get it wrong, please feel free to ask me questions. And of course you want to cite your sources so other people can find where you got your sources, so you don't want them to get lost. You want it to be accurate and more or less clear. Where did I find this? There are a number of ways of representing your sources. The MLA is a common method, the APA is another common method, and the Chicago Manual of Style is a third. You can see that they were each founded in different years, and you can see that they were each founded for slightly different purposes, but all of them were founded to standardize the way we represent what we understand and know. The Chicago is a little bit the older of the three, and it was really meant to help with the University of Chicago, and there have been 17 revisions, including matters that handle difficult fonts or photo typesetting, word processing, copyright law, computers, and the web. Each of those things were addressed with the revisions of the Chicago. Let me just look at something to help you understand what each of these methods do. So for the APA, the date is forefronted. You have the person who wrote the article or wrote the book, but the date is the next thing you see. And the APA emphasizes relevant and new discoveries by important people in the field. It emphasizes dates, which is why it's used frequently by the sciences. The MLA and the Chicago both emphasize the author first, and the date comes at the end. In other words, I read the important thinkers in my field who said relevant and new things. So the MLA and the Chicago, which are organized alphabetically by last name, are often used by the humanities, and the Chicago is usually favored by the not by the scientists, but by the historians, and by historians of science. So if you are wondering what is the method for the Chicago, like how do I put things together, NCC has a wonderful library resource. I'm giving you the website here. Just go to the NCC library, you will find this. It's terrific, it's useful, and if you have questions about it, again, I'm happy to help you either by email or by office hours. I'm going to give you an example here of what slide 6 should look like. I've put my notes on what the sources are doing above. You can put them below. Either way is fine. Last but not least, why the Chicago? Well, a lot of people who are historians like to hold 2 or 3 conversations at once. They'll have perhaps in footnote 1, they'll have something that tells you a little bit about other people who agree with the author. In footnote 2, they might tell you, here's some people who disagree with the author. And in footnote 3, they might make some commentary about a point that they would like you to know that doesn't really belong in the primary argument, but they still want to tell you about it. So the Chicago is for people who like to have a kind of a relationship with their sources, like a jam session. They want you to hear many voices combining, and you want to hear some of the sub-points and the sub-arguments, and footnotes do that best. And that is why the people who like the Chicago tend to like footnotes, tend to want to have 2 or 3 conversations at once and kind of have a loose but active relationship with the sources. So what we've gone through is that you need to consider your purpose, and I've said that in this class, most of the time you're going to be trying to change the understanding of your classmates. You're going to want to look at the range of sources required by your research, which depends very much on how much literature there's written about the subject and the expertise of the audience. Here we're imagining an audience that is not very expert, but you do want to remember that sort of a number like 5 is not a good answer to the question of how many sources do I need. It really is governed by the kind of research you're doing and the kind of expertise of your audience. You should look for primary and secondary sources. In this project, you don't necessarily need to look for primary sources, but some of you have them and they look just fine. So make sure to cite your sources, just to ensure accuracy, attribution. We're using the Chicago. For the research paper, we will be doing footnotes and a bibliography, but right now we're just using the bibliography format, and you're putting that in your project slide 6, I think it is. And we like the Chicago because the Chicago kind of gives you the opportunity to host a jam session and footnotes with the sources. Now, what to do if you are young at any age, meaning you're new to the field? Well, don't panic. You're not going to learn everything you need to know in the first pass. You will probably miss an important source, or you will probably miss something that you didn't know existed. Look for the endnotes and the bibliographies of the articles you're already looking at. They will be a great source for you. Be creative about what you Google. Don't be afraid to look at the bottom of Wikipedia or to look at the bottom of any encyclopedia to see what sources they give you. If you can, talk to people who you think might be an expert in the field who can guide you in some way. Just be patient with yourself and realize it will take a little while to learn things. This is one of those classes where you're going to be learning things. So I hope you enjoy the process of learning and be patient with yourself.